Good morning, good day, and good evening to all of you. We are very, very pleased that tonight we have this dialogue between two very eminent thinkers and activist thinkers. We have with us Gustavo Esteva, who is from the Earth University in Mexico. He is a grassroots activist, independent writer, and a public intellectual. He has authored more than 40 books and many essays and articles. And I've heard from a friend that Gustavo actually has a list of over 100 books to write. So we are still expecting the other 60 books. Gustavo has been awarded the National Award of Economics and National Award of Journalism. And he's a columnist of La Jornada and occasionally in The Guardian. And he was the advisor of the Zapatistas in their negotiations with the government in 1995 to 96. And so I will introduce more about Sainath from the People's Archive of Rural India later. But then it is such a pleasure to bring the two of you together so that we will be having a very good dialogue on the question of the future of humanity and alternatives to capitalism. So now I would like to invite Gustavo to talk for 30 minutes about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Kinchi. I feel very honored of the invitation. Thanks for the invitation. And then let's start. The future. Perhaps Agamben is right. The future has no longer a future. Financial power had kidnapped all fate and all future, all the time and all the hopes. As the late Zapatista Subcomandante Margo said 10 years ago, we live in a peculiar moment in which to smell the future, we need to look into the past. Archaeology, not futurology, is the only way to access the present. We are now facing radical uncertainty. Millions of people, not only the powers that be, want the end of the current emergency by the pandemic and to come back to whatever form of normality. But many millions more are saying the opposite. We will not return to normality because normality was the problem. The pandemic precipitated decisions that governments have not dared to try. They mark a path towards conditions in which machines will replace all contact, all contagion between human beings. Not even Orwell was able to imagine such dystopia. Democracy is being democratically dismantled. In many places, the police arrived before the medical personnel. Many people, until yesterday passionate advocates of democratic practices, are fervently applauding the process that eliminates them. What Foucault called the fascist that we all carry inside, the one that makes us love the power that oppresses us, is exploited in the name of the pandemic. COVID-19 could be justifying general obedience to often foolish rules and instructions. The broth of social discipline necessary to establish the new authoritarian regime is thus cultivated. At the same time, the spirit of the mobilizations of 2019 re-emerged in many different ways. During the pandemic, there was a deep and wide wake-up. The decisions taken to deal with the pandemic made evident some of the worst aspects of the modern society. It was virtually impossible to keep the eyes closed. When people opened them, they saw the horror, and they woke up within a nightmare. There was fear and confusion and even desperation, but also the decision to do something. all kinds of initiatives were taking, challenging the dominant system and creating an option. As a consequence, we have now what can be described as a profound bifurcation to deal with the systemic chaos Immanuel Wallerstein and Aníbal Quijano identified years ago. We have, on the one side, forces trying to establish an unprecedented authoritarian rule to continue an equally unprecedented accumulation and concentration of wealth. They will also proceed with the destruction of the environment and the social fabric characteristic of recent decades. On the other side, there are grassroots initiatives everywhere, which are already constructing technological, political, and cultural alternatives to the dominant system. They have been creating all kinds of networks to support each other and to advance in the organization of a critical mass of people that can resist the authoritarian wave and generate an option. No one can anticipate the outcome of this gigantic confrontation, but what we know is that we will be living in a new world, because the world we knew is already dead. To be precise, the title of this session alludes to alternatives to capitalism. In my view, what we have ahead of us is clearly beyond capitalism, a post-capitalist world. Capitalism is dead. Let's be clear. Most of what is produced today in the world follows the capitalist logic. But the regime dies when it cannot be reproduced in its own terms, not when the last trace of its form of existence disappears. There are still remnants of the feudal system everywhere, but it is dead. It lost its reproductive capacity long time ago. There are many ways to characterize capitalism and to define its nature, but there is universal consensus since Adam Smith that labor as a source of value is what constitutes it. What has been called primitive or original accumulation was not the dispossession of means of production, for example, in the well-known enclosure of the commons. Those means of production became capital only when they bought a specific commodity, the labor force. There is today capitalist accumulation in capitalist enterprises, but at a global level, it becomes impossible to transform all the wealth currently accumulated into capital. An increasing portion of it cannot buy labor. This situation can be described as a world of zombies controlled by vampires. Capitalist enterprises don't know they are dead. They blame the banks, the government, the virus, plain bad luck for what is happening to them. They are zombies. Above them, a very small group of people, the vampires, is sucking from them and from everyone everything they can. Surplus value, labor rights, land, anything. They are accumulating wealth like never before. A few guys own more wealth than half the people on earth, but they cannot transform that wealth into capital. They are not buying labor force. They can be called suckers, extractivists, not capitalist producers or entrepreneurs. Those that since the 90s have been describing this process, like Ansel Happe, one for very good reasons, that the end of capitalism is not good news. It is not an opportunity for emancipation, but a fall into barbaric conditions. We are already living in a new era. It does not have a name because of the bifurcation. The current confrontation may have very diverse outcomes, but it is already and will continue to be a post-capitalist society. It seems impossible to come back to the social and material conditions allowing for the capitalist regime. The same can be said about the political form of capitalism, the nation state. Its rituals and some of its elements are still around, but it is impossible today for any national government to fulfill its main function in a nation state, the administration of the national economy. All the economies are today exposed to transnational forces that no government can control. National sovereignty is a very important piece in the political design of the nation state. It is ready for the museum. Capitalism was born with a world vocation, but the nation state was the main arena for its flourishing and expansion. National governments created and administered markets and protected capital from its own excesses. When international operations reached magnitudes that started to have critical impacts on the national economies, new international institutions were created to put some order in those operations and establish some rules for the world trade. They never were very effective. The crisis of the nation state forced the attempt to create substitutes at the macro-national level for the administration of the economy. They failed. We don't have at national or international level dispositives to administer the economy. We are indeed in systemic chaos. The national governments, at times behaving as mere ghosts, still perform some functions. They still have the police, the army, taxes. Some institutions remain in operation. But all those institutions, as Ivan Illich warned 50 years ago, are already counterproductive. They are producing the opposite of what they are supposed to do. The school system produces ignorance. The health systems are sickening and killing us. Urban rapid transportation is paralyzing us. The rituals of the nation state are displayed more than ever to pretend that it is alive and well and even more powerful than ever. But it is dead. A furious wave of calls to generate patriotic emotions will not be able to resurrect it. Rather than authentic national projects, they are used as pretexts for authoritarian projects. As the capitalist mode of production became a mode of dispossession, the democratic facade was no longer needed. Governments resort to public force and unlimited violence with all kinds of pretexts to replace its vanishing political power. Racism, sexism, and homophobia inherent to the dominant regime are becoming increasingly evident. The rule of law becomes an illusion under the declared or undeclared state of emergency. The despotic and oligarchic nature of democracy finally becomes evident. The neoliberal order itself has also collapsed. International institutions and arrangements are now increasingly challenged or simply abandoned because no legal order is needed to operate massive dispossession at every level in the current systemic chaos. The internal strategies between old and new powers establish a multipolar system with great tensions and instabilities. The dismantling of the democratic facade reveals the growing ungovernability and inability of the political classes to peacefully exercise the function of government. With the complicity of the majority of the mass media, the lie, the so-called post-truth, becomes the foundation of domination. Many governments that lost most of their political power in recent years and were increasingly forced to rule by decree and the increasing use of force suddenly recovered the illusion of political power with the pandemic. The fear they created among the people and their supposed scientific cover-up forced millions to obediently follow all kinds of government instructions, very effective to control the people, not the virus. The illusion is vanishing, but the operation became an unprecedented experiment in social control. The digitalization of society, already in full swing, looked suddenly feasible and socially and politically acceptable for many millions of people, which even enjoyed their new condition. All this is not what Samir Amin called the implosion of capitalism or a mid-turning point in the global, regional, and national order. It is the end of an era with a civilizational crisis and a metabolic rupture. Since the intellectual pillars of what was called modernity were dismantled in the last 30 years, we don't have the intellectual tools needed to understand the current situation. Yes, the world we knew is dead. Since we could not organize a proper funeral, all kinds of pests are emanated from the unburied corpse. One of them is called today COVID-19. Many more are coming. In the midst of this horror, new horizons are looming everywhere. I could not find a better illustrations of the new horizon of the powers that be that a recent declaration of the organizers of the famous World Economic Forum, which gather every year in Davos some of the richer and most powerful people on earth. A few days ago, they announced that next January they will present to the world the Great Reset, a commitment to build the foundations of economic and social system for more fair, sustainable, and resilient future. It requires, they said, a new social contract centered on human dignity, social justice, and where societal progress does not fall behind economic development. We only have one planet, they added, and we know that climate change would be the next global disaster with even more dramatic consequences for humankind. We have to decarbonize the economy in the short window still remaining and bring our thinking and behavior once more into harmony with nature. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres celebrated immediately the initiative. We can see in these statements a desperate call to recover the leadership in the world affairs, offering the usual concessions in the language and adopting some of the claims expressed in recent mobilization. They try to use words that give a decent appearance to the discourse. They want to change everything for nothing to change. Like The Guardian, we must abandon expressions like climate change or global warming, which are mere euphemisms. We are currently suffering a metabolic rupture. It is indeed ridiculous to observe that climate change could be the next global disaster. The disaster already happened. What we need to do is to stop aggravating it through denial and marginal reforms. The Great Reset is just actualizing the false promise of the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, when the governments and the corporations invented global ecology to steal from the environmental movement the claims for radical change and take into their hands its direction, and we know the result. Instead of the fundamental change already needed 30 years ago, they strengthened the path of irresponsible destruction and adopted marginal, almost irrelevant measures. You can put lipstick on a pig, but it is still a pig. The powers that be will use a slightly modified language to continue their exercise in domination and control. Many people will join them in that suicidal path. We need to be fully aware that this is one of the options before us, but there is also another one. An era does not end when a group of revolutionaries challenges it, but when ordinary people, often for sheer survival, adopt a new path, trespassing cultural boundaries and establishing new social facts. The first bourgeois and proletarians died without knowing the new conditions. Their mind, their mentality were still rooted in the ancien regime, even if the new one was already born. We cannot take today that risk. To stop the current horror, we need to be fully aware of the implications of what we are doing. This is not the time for seizing La Bastille or the Winter Palace. In the Leninist tradition that shaped the 20th century, what is in order is a new kind of revolution. To undermine the need of the oppressive state apparatuses on useless for emancipation instead of taking them into our hands. The current struggle for survival can no longer be reduced to expropriate the expropriators, as we said a century ago. Capitalism is not only a mode of production, but a specific social organization. It currently covers all aspects of social lives, including psychologies and emotions, behaviors and attitudes, desires and aspirations. It is not only in the hands of the owners of the means of production and of the public administrators. It has permeated the whole society and penetrated through every pore. But it is not an almighty and omnipresent monolith. It is impossible to find places of people without some level of contamination, but there are, particularly among indigenous people, ways of being and thinking with an anti-capitalist vocation. And the current wave of violence and destruction is fostering struggles against capital, which start in the heart, the head, and the hands of people increasingly discontent with the situation. A new social force, transforming rebellion into indignation, is transforming rebellion and indignation into a political revolution, and is thus beginning to take place. Friendship cannot flower today out of political life. We need to cultivate disciplined, self-denying, careful, tasteful friendships, which are today the key, the powerful force, the stuff radiating out the communal spirit for the rebirth of the commons. Hope is the very essence of popular movements. Non-conformity and discontent are not enough. Neither is critical awareness enough. People mobilize themselves when they think their action may bring about change, when they have hope. To survive in this abominable storm falling on us, we need to recover it as a social force. As I said at the beginning, the future has no longer future. We already entered into an era of radical uncertainty. Whoever pretends to know what will happen is because he or she lacks information. We don't know. We need to open ourselves to surprise. Hope is not the conviction that something will happen in a certain way, but the conviction that something makes sense, whatever happens. What makes sense today, first of all, is to recover sense of proportion. The limited talent available to ordinary mortals, like every one of us, or like every one of those occupying the highest positions of economic or political power, cannot deal with the devastating scale of the current economic and political fluctuations. We need to scale down both our thinking and our behavior in order to act in what can produce real change. People are using every opportunity of their inevitable local rooting to regain meaning in their lives and recover their senses. Millions of people are now forced to locally produce their own lives. Neither the market nor the state will be able to take care of them. Thousands of urban and rural communities are no longer obliged to dance the music that all kinds of social forces played for them and now are silent. They have to create survival conditions by themselves. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the importance of the local and a new sense of relation with Mother Earth is restored. The main battle of the current war will be fought in the stomach. During the emergency, millions of people were fed at home by the dominant system. If that pattern continues, and most people consume again the food offered in the market, agribusiness may intensify its devastating operation, generating more pandemics. Rich Argentine pampas will continue to be used to feed Chinese pigs, and the Amazon will become a soybeans factory. The dominant food system loves to feed people in their home. If they could, they would feed them in the mouth as with babies. But people are already resisting. In these times of global fear, wrote the Uruguayan poet Eduardo Galeano, whoever doesn't fear hunger is afraid of eating. 1 billion people will go tonight to bed with an empty stomach, and all the rest know that what they are buying in the market contains toxins. It would be insane to expect that governments and international institutions that created the current mess will address it appropriately, or that the CEOs of Monsanto, Walmart, Amazon, and the rest will suffer a moral epiphany and will begin to do next Monday the opposite of what they are doing. We need to take this fundamental matter into our hands, and that is exactly what people are doing. Everywhere, urban agriculture is now epidemic. Some cities produce today more than half of what they eat. New arrangements between farmers and urban consumers redefine the market. Small farmers, mainly women, feed today 70% of the people on Earth, in spite of the fact that transnational agribusiness currently control more than half of the global food resources. 2 months ago, a peculiar shortage arose in New York and other big cities. The yeast to make bread ran out. Thousands of families were recovering traditions and skill to prepare their own food. Many people learned with emergency that the places where they live may no longer be mere bedrooms and TV rooms. They could again become homes for the daily practice of the art of eating, the art of dwelling, the joy of living. Most people, either confined or forced to struggle in the streets for survival, either constrained by imposed rules that they consider appropriate to obey, even when they seem foolish, or in the freedom of towns and neighborhoods that are defining their own norms, were forced by the pandemic to reconsider the direction of their gaze. They began to see their places again, the specific persons around them. All this implies returning to what we are, what Dharma expresses in India, or comunalidad among the indigenous peoples of Oaxaca, persons, not subnets of concrete relationships, which can only be what they are when those nets form community. There is no better antidote against the rampant authoritarianism stimulated by the pandemic in the last expression of the patriarchal kingdom. In every area of daily life, we can see people slowly assuming the control of their lives by substituting nouns creating dependence, education, food, health, shelter, for verbs reclaiming their personal and communal agency, learning, eating, healing, settling. They are giving back to eating the central place it had in the past and assuming full responsibility for what they eat and drink. They're applying again the art of dwelling, the art to give shape to the world in a certain place. They are, for example, dealing honestly and smartly with the moral predicament of shitting the water, that sacred blessing, through the wide variety of dry toilets, and so on and so forth. Friendship, hope, and surprise seem to be the three pillars supporting the regeneration of the daily life of an increasing number of people. They know that the only way to resist the current horror is to create something new, a new society, and that is exactly what they are doing. The title of this session has stopped my way of thinking all these weeks when I was trying to discover what to say here today. For many years, I have been engaged in a position that explicitly affirms that we are back from the future. Never again we will subordinate our life to any kind of promised land with any theoretical, political, or religious shape. I accepted to participate in this panel against my convictions about the future because we are in a very peculiar moment in history. We are on edge, already falling into the abyss. If we continue that path, the Davos reset, the post-capitalist continuation of capitalism, the world in the hands of the big and the powerful, supported by millions fully affiliated to authoritarian rule, the millions ready to be fed by the food system, nourishing the machine with their consumerism. If we continue that path, we will not have planet to inhabit, no possibility of survival for the human species. This is not apocalyptic randomness or millenarian foolishness. These do not imply embracing a catastrophic mood to produce fear and paralysis. This is a very realistic assessment of what we already know about the situation of Mother Earth. She can no longer take the destruction we have been imposing to her. Humanity does not have any future if we continue the dominant path before forces that we cannot stop. At the same time, timidly, humbly, I want to conclude by sharing a feeling, not an argument. What I am feeling at the grassroots, what I see every day, everywhere, what ordinary women and men are expressing with their courageous behavior is very simple. Basta, enough. We can no longer put our lives in the hands of the market or the state. Let's do it. Let's begin to live our own lives, not the lives shaped by others, imposing needs and desires on everyone. With them, humanity may still have a future. Arundhati Roy is right. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. You have spoken so beautifully, and your words touched the heart. Now, may I invite Sainath to talk to us. Sainath is well, he's heading the People's Archive of Rural India. He's a working journalist, and already in 2015 he completed 35 years in the profession. So now we add 5 to that. He's a former rural affairs editor of the Hindu, and he's author of the book Everybody Loves a Good Drought. And actually, I was very privileged to have read the book as soon as it was published in those years. And it has been through a very dear friend of ours, Vinod Reiner, that we have come to know each other. So, Sainath, please.
Thank you. I think Gustavo has made things very difficult for me. He has just about said everything that there is to be said, and all of which I'm in agreement with. Second is that if I had known that he is such a hard act to follow, I would have spoken first. But I'm going to try and enter this with a slightly off-the-wall analogy to the kind of debates I'm finding in the mainstream or corporate media. And, as we search for solutions and futures and are looking at what kind of medical approaches we should have to COVID, it's worth looking at the tenacity of ruling elites in clinging on desperately to fervently held ideological beliefs. Let me take one that is about 3,000 years old. Bloodletting was a common medical treatment for nearly 3,000 years. The idea, strongly held in Europe in the Middle Ages, actually originated with Hippocrates and Galen in terms of the 4 humors of the human body. Galen wrote a lot about it 2,000 years ago, that ill health was the imbalance of the 4 humors of the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And the imbalance of these humors was what caused us to be ill. This and other reasons driven by surgical experimentation and plain superstition led to bleeding the body, getting rid of the bad blood, if you will, so to speak, getting rid of the bad blood, so to speak, in order to save the patient, right? So it also involved bloodletting as a medical practice, involved the use of leeches. Leeches were used for bloodletting, including the medicinal leech, Hinudo medicinalis. We don't know how many human beings across 3,000 years died from this practice of medical treatment, of trying to save them through bloodletting. We do know that Charles II, King of England, died soon after 24 ounces of blood were taken from his body. We do know that George Washington's 3 doctors drained him of copious amounts of blood. He died a night later. COVID-19 has given us a brilliant, thorough autopsy of neoliberalism, of capitalism itself. The corpse is on the table. In glaring light, every vein, artery, organ, and other feature, bones, every feature of it stares us in the face. And you can see all the leeches: privatization, corporate globalization, extreme concentration of wealth, extreme levels, obscene levels of inequality, unseen in living memory. The bloodletting approach to social and economic ills that has seen societies bleed working people of the basics of decent and dignified human existence. This 3,000-year-old medical practice of bloodletting reached its peak in Europe in the 19th century. Its discrediting in medical treatment came only in the very late 19th century and the 20th centuries. It's discrediting as a medical treatment. But the doctrine and practice has a very powerful following in the fields of economics, philosophy, business, and society. Some of the most powerful social and economic doctors, even today, standing around the corpse, they argue, as their predecessors in the Middle Age did, when they have lost their patient, they shake their heads sadly and say, "We didn't bleed him enough." Precisely as the World Bank and the IMF have whined for decades that the horrific damage of their shock and awe treatment, sometimes near genocidal structural adjustment, was not because their reforms went too far, but because their reforms, alas, did not go far enough. Indeed, they were not allowed to. And that was the problem, really, right? So, for inequality, was actually in the last 30 years glorified as a virtue. It brings out the best in human beings. Competition spurs us on. Inequality is so central to any debate, any discussion we have on the future of humanity and alternatives. And the ruling elites know this. For 20 years now, they've been savaging the suggestion that inequality has anything to do with humanity's problems. Early this millennium, the Brookings Institute warned against what it called the debilitating discussion on inequality. Just 3 months ago, just 3 months before COVID-19 ruled the world, The Economist magazine, Neoliberalism's Oracle of Delphi, read the global entrails before it and ran a very bitter and angry cover story. This is December 2019, The Economist. The headline was, "Inequality Illusions: Why Wealth and Income Gaps Are Not What They Appear." These might well be the most famous last words since Tarzan moaned, "Who greased the bloody grape wine?" The Economist then goes on to blast the numbers relating to income and wealth, attempts to discredit the sources that produce the numbers, and says angrily, these ridiculous beliefs persist even in the world of polarization, fake news, and social media. Now, COVID-19 has given us an authentic autopsy, debunking the witch doctors of neoliberalism. Right? Yet their thinking dominates, for instance, the corporate media, and I really think that progressives don't and have not for decades given importance to the role corporate media play in sustaining the global structures of inequity, inhuman structures that we have. So even though they are discredited by the authentic autopsy of COVID-19, their thinking still dominates the media, which are busy finding ways of how not to link the destruction of the past 3 months in any way to capitalism. It's perversely amusing how ready we are to discuss pandemics and even the possible end of humanity, how reluctant we are to discuss the end of neoliberalism and capitalism, in the media at least. The search is on for how quickly can we overcome the problem and return to normal. But the problem was not returning to normal. The normal was the problem. The more cagey of the ruling elites understand, they've been banding about words. The new normal. What is this new normal? The pre-COVID normal. In January 2020, if you will, we learned that the 22 richest men in the world held more wealth than 60% of the world's population. The new normal, America's billionaires in the first 3 weeks of the pandemic added more wealth than they held in total before 1980. Okay? In 3 weeks of the pandemic, they added more wealth than all the American billionaires had together made prior to 1980. A normal where billions lived in hunger in a world that was bursting with food grain, tons of food grain. In India today, in today's India, the government of India has a surplus, what it calls a surplus, I disagree with that word, buffer stocks of 82 million tons of food grain, and Indians have never been hungrier in independent India's history. 82 million tons of food grain. Do you know how much that is? If you took the sacks we use to put that food grain in and you laid them out in a single row, you'd be able to go to the moon and back on that row, on that ladder. So that was, by the way, that was always the case in India ever since we embraced the world of neoliberalism. It was the case in year 2000, in year 2005, that we had gigantic stockpiles of grain and the hungriest population in the world. So what's the new normal? The new normal is exactly what we are doing now. The government distributes very little of the grain free and has actually sanctioned, believe it or not, it has sanctioned the conversion of gigantic quantities of rice into ethanol to make hand sanitizer. So we are going to destroy millions of tons of food to create a chemical so you can clean your hands and hope to thereby avoid COVID-19. The normal was an India where full-time farmers lost their status as full-time farmers in the neoliberal era at the rate of 2,000 every 24 hours for 20 years. That's what neoliberalism did to Indian agriculture. In other words, the population of full-time farmers in this country fell by 15 million between census 1991 and census 2011. 2,000 a day. Now, where did they go? What happened to these farmers? Well, about 315,000 of them, I repeat, government figure, about 315,000 of them committed suicide, took their own lives. There was a period between 2001 2011 when one farmer took his or her life every 32 minutes. Many millions more did not commit suicide, but they fell into the ranks of the agrarian underclass, agricultural laborers, or they migrated in millions out of the villages to the cities, to the towns, to anywhere in search of jobs that were never there. So that was what was happening with neoliberalism and agriculture. What's the new normal? That was normal. The new normal is that tens of millions of migrants from the cities and towns have been returning to their villages. Okay? It is the greatest movement of human beings in this country, greater than that seen at the time of India's partition into India and Pakistan. Even that never saw this scale, where 20 million human beings at least were moving about, trying to go back to their villages. Now, since the government, by the way, this mass exodus was sparked by a speech of the Prime Minister on the night of March 24th, in which he declared a war on COVID, and in which he announced he gave a nation of 1.3 billion people 4 hours to shut down. 4 hours to shut down. So what happened? Millions of migrants knew very well that they should not trust us middle-class employers or their factory owners. They knew that we were going to do nothing for them, and we were going to congratulate ourselves on television about our compassion for them. They didn't need our compassion. They needed justice. They needed the enforcement of their rights. They needed, in fact, we subsequently dismantled many of those rights by suspending 38 labor laws in one state, the largest state in the country of India, Uttar Pradesh, more than 200 million human beings. We have suspended 38 labor laws. But let's come back to what happens to these millions as they walk home. What happens to the millions as they walk home? Many of them are walking in the month of May in temperatures of 43 to 46, 47 degrees Celsius. One little girl, an agricultural labor, a chili picker from Chhattisgarh state in the state of Telangana, working in the state of Telangana, as she walked home, Jamlo, age 12, this little indigenous person, a tribal girl, walked 140 kilometers in 3 days and nights and fell dead in exhaustion 60 kilometers from her mother's house in Chhattisgarh state. Millions went through this experience. A hell of a lot more people, if only we could ever get hold of the data, a hell of a lot more people probably are dying in this country from non-COVID diseases than from COVID-19. Because of the entire diversion of the few medical resources we have in the public sphere to dealing only with COVID-19. So people are dying of heart failure, diabetics, strokes, all kinds of other diseases, including hunger, exhaustion, like little Jamlo. Close to 10 million human beings went on the trains organized by the government more than a month after the lockdown. And so already 10 million had moved on foot. Okay. So normal was an overwhelmingly private healthcare sector. so expensive that for years, the largest number of individual bankruptcies in the United States came from health spending. In India, in this decade, in a single year, 55 million human beings fell below the poverty line due to health spending in a single year in this decade. The new normal, even greater corporate control over healthcare, horrible profiteering in the healthcare sector that drive towards greater private control, even as a few capitalist nations like Spain and Ireland actually nationalized all private health facilities. But they're not going to keep it nationalized. Like Sweden nationalized banks in the early 90s, only to nourish them back to health with public resources and return them to private ownership. That's what Sweden did in 94. Spain and Ireland will almost certainly do the same with health facilities. In many ways, the new normal in India is very like the old normal, but the new normal is the old normal on steroids. That's the direction we're going. In India, domestic violence, wife beating, these were always normal. Okay? Now, they're happening on an incredible scale where the chiefs of police are saying, we fear it is extremely high now and unreported. The normal for New Delhi was that it long ago beat Beijing to the record of being the most polluted city in the world, capital city in the world. The one pleasant fallout of the COVID crisis was that the skies over Delhi are cleaner than they have ever been because of the cessation of hazardous industrial activity. The new normal is that this clean air nonsense ought to be done away with. Right? So we have the new normal, old normal, that all of this is a lot of nonsense. And a massive rise in production of coal is in the middle of the pandemic. The government of India announced the privatization and auction of thousands of coal blocks so that we can have a massive production in coal. It was always normal in India that the words climate change were very hard to spot in public or political discourse. This despite human agency-led climate change having already devastated Indian agriculture for several decades. In the People's Archive of Rural India, through the last year, we covered the damage done to each of the different agroclimatic zones in this country, some 16, 17 of them. The new normal is too often the old normal on steroids. In state after Indian state, labor laws have been suspended or violated. I don't know how many people in the world know that in India, we have reversed the gold standard of labor law. The 8-hour day in many Indian states, in several Indian states, is no longer an 8-hour day. It is a 12-hour day. And in some of those states, the additional 4 hours are not even given overtime. They're not paid overtime. In agriculture, there's a really frightening situation developing. Remember that through the 80s, 90s, the World Bank and the IMF got poor countries, small farmers, to shift to cash crops from food crops. You know, cash crops will earn you dollars, and dollars will liberate you from poverty, because cash crops will be exported and be paid for in hard currency. Now, millions of farmers in this country alone are lying with their cash crop, which they're never going to be able to sell, and are repeating the crop in the new season, because that's what they've been given credit to do. So a lot of the old cash, a lot of the last season's crop, March, April crop, is lying, either the perishable stuff has died. We are having millions of pounds of cotton and sugarcane piling up inside the homes of the farmers, which they will never sell, and their fields having been used 100% for cash crop. What sort of a food security situation will they face soon? So, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm taking too much time on this, and I have to give Kichi my alternatives. Actually, the terrible thing is that the political right is in great consolidation in many parts of the world, not just in India. And India is ruled by an alliance of socio-religious fundamentalists and economic market fundamentalists. Many have a foot in both camps. Many are equally at home in both camps. But the first answer to capitalism is no capitalism. Okay? The old methods of better development, inclusive development, development with a human face, all of that is just so much junk, right? We have to now dismantle what we can, where we can. For me personally, the focus being on corporate ownership of critical sectors, food, health, and education. We need to dismantle corporate monopolies in every sphere that we can. Look, the livelihoods that have been destroyed by the growing corporate monopolies, the only way you're going to revive them is to end corporate rule, whereas we are very swiftly consolidating as a corporate state with a strong religious fundamentalist flavor. Now, what are the frameworks we can have? What are the frameworks that we can approach it with? And there, I think I'm not going to say anything much different from Gustavo, who points out that even the deadheads of Davos are trying to steal that language. But it's very clear to me that not inclusive or more caring or anything like that, any of the battles and struggles ahead are going to happen through the framework of justice, whether it's food justice, health justice, or social justice. These are things that we are going to have to approach in terms of justice, not in terms of inclusion, inclusiveness, or all that pussyfooting, tinkering, trying to build a better capitalism. That's not going to happen. Yeah. And there are movements. There are movements. There are struggles which have been showing us that the way forward for some years now. Okay, whether it is the Zapatistas, whether it is the MST, whether it is the Kudumbashree in Kerala, which I have followed for 20 years, a movement of 4.3 million women, yeah, landless women. These women who actually taught me, this movement taught me their understanding, their concept of two things. One, solidarity economies. What is a solidarity economy? And the second, food justice, food security and food sovereignty being extremely limited concepts. You could have both and still have a producer starving at the lowest levels. The Kudumbashree's approach, of course, it has to happen on that scale in the left-ruled state of Kerala, was the producer shall never go hungry. Today in Kerala, in those 4.3 million women who are doing thousands of different kinds of enterprises, more than 250,000 of them are running tiny collective farms, but they don't use the word collective farm for fear of, it rings all kinds of bells in people's head. So they call it Sangha Krishi, group farming. None of these women is a landowner. Okay? Groups of 4 work on 1 acre of land. Groups of 10 work on 1 hectare of land, which is 2.5 acres. Believe it or not, these are the only farmers in the last 20 years in India that I have seen make profits. Their collective strength, their solidarity economy, the way they, and the principle of justice on which they function for the producer, it is simple. If they produce, say, 1,000 tons of paddy, 1,000 tons of rice, you cannot sell a single kilogram of that 1,000 tons on the market until the demands and needs of the families of those women in that collective are fully met, only after that may you export your surplus to the market, not before. You cannot. That is the principle. Just before COVID-19 broke, in People's Archive of Rural India, we were thinking of how do we apply this concept to India's unbelievably bad health situation. We were and we are going to look at health justice as we've been looking at COVID-19 in terms of livelihood justice. The collapse of millions of livelihoods, not just the migrants, but even those living in the villages. If you go to the People's Archive of Rural India website, ruralindiaonline.org, we publish in 13 languages, you will see more than 100 stories, multimedia, from 35 regions of the country on what's happening to ordinary people. In conclusion, I think the battles for justice are going to be what will determine what happens. I also think it's going to be incredibly difficult and incredibly bad time. It's never been easy. It's going to be worse, but it can be done. And I think, as I said, there are these movements showing us the way. There are more people willing to listen to critiques of capitalism now, I think, than earlier. And I think for some time now, even before COVID, what Hugo said, there is no force on earth mightier than an idea whose time has come. I think this decade has been the time for that idea of justice. And the struggles we must wage against it, I have no idea how they will roll out. I have no idea how we will do a number of these things, but I know that they will happen. Thank you.